It is my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, really an extraordinary person in the world of roses. And many of you know him all very well from his speaking engagements and his great visibility in the world of the American Rose Society. He writes with great knowledge on all rose topics and speaks with ease to rosarians across the country and in other countries. He's the editor, and has been for 15 years, of Horizon Roses. And he's published more than 600 articles in the rose world. He received the Klima Gold Medal for his outstanding service and other significant awards, they're just too numerous to mention, from his 40 years as a rosarian. And he's come up to the Marin Rose Society and he's given talks to us. And sometimes when he's up here from Southern California, he just drops into our meetings and attends and enjoys a rose show. So he's a guy, he gets around a lot of places and does a lot of things, and we appreciate that. I want you to know now he's up for the election to be the next vice president of the American Rose Society. And I believe he is the person for this job, considering his love of roses, which is so extensive, and his breadth of skill and his long and excellent service. Bob Martin.
It's a great pleasure to be here today. I'm honored to follow Greg Lowry, who I've known for many years, and I think very highly of his organization and what he's done in the past and what he's tried to do, and urge you to join the Friends of Vintage Gardens. I have, and it's interesting, as I will point out, some places in this program that in many respects our careers have crossed or started from the same place. He mentioned the 1971 book, Ortho book. That's my first rose book as well, and it led him in a different direction than mine, but in many areas our paths have crossed. My topic today are things about roses I didn't learn in kindergarten. And for those of you wondering about the picture, that is in fact me in kindergarten, which is now 65 years ago. Frank mentioned the Klima Medal, and I start with the Klima Medal. Here's a photograph of 5 of the recent winners of the Klima Medal. There's Dr. Gary Barlow, Dr. Louis Shoup, Dr. Tommy Cairns, Dr. Andrew Plaz, and the former kindergarten student wearing our Klima medals. I put that up there because in order to, when you receive the Klima medal, you are asked to give a lecture, which is called the Klima Lecture. Gary Barlow, who received it in 2006, gave his Klima lecture in Seattle using as his theme the book, All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. He is a consummate arranger and educator and was able to relate the things that were in this book to being a rose arranger. And it was an absolutely delightful talk. And having heard that talk, I said, well, I want to do that someday, to try to take some of the things I've learned and explain how I learned them all in kindergarten. So when it came to putting together this talk, I got, first of all, an inspiration to look at where I went to kindergarten. And this is where I went to kindergarten. That is Robinson School in Akron, Ohio. And I got the book to see what Robert Fulghum, the author, had learned about that he'd learned in kindergarten. He learned to share everything, play fair, don't hit people, put things back where you find them, clean up your own mess, don't take things that aren't yours, say you're sorry when you hurt somebody, wash your hands before you eat, and flush. Those of you who are arrangers can immediately see how several of those are applicable, particularly in making arrangements at show. Share everything, don't hit people. I looked at this list and thought about it, and I had this reaction of, I didn't learn any of those things in kindergarten. how can I put together a program about what I learned in kindergarten and how it applies to roses when I didn't learn any of these things? I could think of some of the things, variations on them, like, for example, don't hit people. Well, this is me. I'm the one in the center with the cowboy hat. This is my older brother. This is our dog Trax. This is my younger brother. And I'm dressed here as Hopalong Cassidy. That was a big deal when I was in kindergarten. And I had boots just exactly like these. These are Hopalong Cassidy boots. Now, the thing I'd remember very well from kindergarten is I had a deep resentment against the girls in the class who could color between the lines. I could not then, and I cannot now, color between lines. And it bothered me a great deal. Now, I had these cowboy boots, and one day my cowboy boots had become very scuffed, and so I decided that I would polish them. And I got out my dad's shoe shine kit, and in it he had a white bottle, a bottle of white polish, I guess you would call it polish, that had like a ball, a cotton ball on a stick. I guess my mother used them for her white shoes. And so you see the inlays on the shoes, and I decided to try to color them in white and fix them, and I made a terrible mess of it. And I went to school, and one of the girls, who could color between the lines, made fun of my work. And so I took off my cowboy boot and I hit her in the head with it. I learned from this that I don't hit girls with cowboy boots because I was thrown out of kindergarten. They were even serious at that point in time, and so I couldn't get back in until my parents came back, and I apologized, and I was readmitted to kindergarten. We also played rose-related games. Ring Around the Rosie was one. And I recall very distinctly one day we were to play Ring Around the Rosie, and the teacher asked us to play Ring Around the Rosie, and I thought the game was childish. Not occurred to me that I was a child. And I refused to play. And to accentuate my refusal, I knocked over the doll cabinet that had dishes in it, whereupon I was thrown out of kindergarten a second time. It is part of the family lore that I am the only kid in the history of Robinson School to have ever been thrown out twice. I don't know if anybody keeps any records of this, but I have been conducting a survey. Has anybody here been thrown out of kindergarten? Baldo was thrown out. Were you thrown out twice?
No.
All right. It takes a special person. I do recall the books that we read. We had the Dick and Jane books. Remember the Dick and Jane books? This was from the book on kindergarten, and they talked about the biggest word of all, look. And oddly enough, I even remember this particular story. Look up. Dick said, look up, look up, look up, up, up. I was mesmerized by that story. And I became very good at looking up. There came a time in kindergarten when I had the opportunity of being thrown out a third time, and I passed on it. The teacher was teaching us one day, and the teacher told us very solemnly that when you come to an intersection, you should cross the street when the light is green, and you should not cross when the light was red. I knew that this was wrong. I knew as a certainty because I had crossed many a street, and I knew for sure that that would get you killed. And I figured my teacher was trying to do that. I thought I'd say something, but having been thrown out twice, I did not. But it's interesting in years later that I began to understand why it is that I thought that. This is how Ohio traffic lights looked then, as they do now in many areas. And if you look up, up, up at them, I would get to the street corner, and I would look up, and it wasn't really apparent which of these lights had anything to do with me, 5 years old, crossing the street. So I would look to see what the drivers were looking at. And if the light was red, they would stop the car, and it was safe to cross the street. And if the light was green, they would go straight on through, and it was not safe to cross the street, and therefore you cross the street on the red light and not on the green. this will explain a great deal about me that you didn't already know, that I have, in many cases, a different perspective. Yes, this story is about roses, and I'm going to fast forward now to 1971. And as I mentioned, I started with the same book Greg Laurie did. This is where I lived. In 1971, we bought a brand new house in the city of Irvine. And my then wife said, as we had the landscapers come to the house, because it was not landscaped, I've always wanted a rose garden. And my reaction was, well, that sounds okay to me. I used to sell flowers on the street corner, so I liked roses. But during the days of my youth, I had traded all my outside jobs for inside jobs. I'd rather clean the toilet than mow the lawn, but okay, you want a rose garden, we'll have a rose garden. And so the landscaper put in the rose garden. And in my rose garden had Garden Party, Mr. Lincoln, Peace, Tropicana, Queen Elizabeth, and Jean Borner. And I got to know their names. I love Peace and I love Mr. Lincoln. And both are in my garden today and have been in every garden that I've ever had. And I also learned something about them because, you see, I had several other plants that the gardener had put in. He put in a lawn. I mowed the lawn. Next week I mowed the lawn. The week after that I mowed the lawn. The week after that I mowed the lawn. And I mowed the lawn, and I mowed the lawn. I got real tired of mowing the lawn. To this day I have somebody come and mow the lawn. But he had put in these plants, and I didn't know what to do with these. I had no idea. And I learned a very important lesson, and it's one that I've kept, and I think it's important that we all keep in mind, that with minimal care, roses are still very beautiful. And these roses were, in fact, beautiful in the garden. I had climbers. I had blaze, golden showers grown as a climber. And the thing I liked about golden showers, you see, I had sold flowers on the street corner, and they were usually these tight buds that you would get for florist-type flowers. And so people didn't realize, I saw these at the end of golden showers, and so I would cut them at this stage and bring them into the house. And my then mother-in-law, whose name was Alona, said that I had a green thumb. Great thing to tell your children or your whoever. I had a green thumb. Wasn't an ounce of truth in this, I must tell you, but I love the idea that I had a green thumb. She loved the roses, and one of the very first roses I ever produced, I named after her, Ilona, unfortunately no longer in commerce. Baldo took this picture of the last known specimen of it. But I learned from that a little encouragement about roses goes a very long way. I had soil in Irvine. That was the type of soil that we have in Southern California that is prominently or predominantly used to build missions. So I decided to do some planting of my own. And the first thing I did in order to do some planting, being a scientific type, is I got a book. And the book said to take a pick and to break up the soil. I didn't own a pick. Being a young lawyer and having more money than sense, I went out and I rented one. And I rented a pick very much like that, and I watered the ground very carefully. And I took the pick in order to break it up, and I took a mighty heave of the pick into the soil. And my soil, of course, looks like this when it's wet. And I can tell you that clay soils do not break up. And in fact, what happened is, having slammed the pick into the ground, I could not get it out of the ground. And I had to go to the car and get a crowbar and pry the pick out of the ground, which left a perfectly square hole in the ground. And I returned my rented pick without trying any further to break up my clay soil. I grew in Irvine for 5 years, and then it came to pass that I took a job at a law firm in downtown Los Angeles, and so I moved to Pasadena, the city of roses, where I lived for 25 years. Wonderful place to grow roses. This was my second rose garden on Annandale Lane in Pasadena, California. This is a fairly recent picture I found, and I found it interesting that the roses I planted are still there. Many of them are. I had that little bitty white fence. See, take a look at that little bitty white fence. What you can't see behind this tree is this tree here, which is a very large tree, a very large Modesto ash, for those of you who care about such things. It is a huge tree whose roots extend into this rose garden. So I decided, this is my first rose garden to plan. Now I have that space to plan the rose garden there along the little fence, and I measured it out, and then I decided how many roses that I could put into it, and so I decided, first of all, that I needed to prepare the soil. Now the area that those roses are planted in actually first consisted of a whole row of silver dollar eucalyptus trees, which my then wife had removed. She didn't remove them, she had someone come and chop them down and remove them, and so my neighbor and I went out with this tiller. And I learned that tilling soil that you have recently dug trees up from but anyway, we got it pretty much tilled, such as it were. And I decided in spacing the roses that I needed to have information, so I went out and I found books again. I have come to I learned years ago an expression, and I learned it because it applies to me so very well, that people prefer to believe what they prefer to be true. And I prefer to believe what I prefer to be true, which is that I could get a lot more roses into this spot, that if I found something that told me that if I could plant them 30 inches apart, that I could plant them 30 inches apart. But you see, if you plant them in triangular spaces like that, you can actually plant them closer. So I scaled it out to plant them. I found this one here that said that you could plant them 24 inches apart, and so I decided to believe that, and so I planted them all in triangles like that, 22 inches apart, figuring that 2 inches wouldn't matter a whole lot one way or the other. And then let's go back and look at this picture here. I have a fence. Now this fence, as you could probably tell there, is a short fence. This fence comes up to about my knee. But I had a fence. And I read in the book that if you have a fence, what should you put on a fence? You should put a climber on the fence. But I have two fences, right? So I could have two, oh, better yet, I could put a climber here, 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 and here, with hybrid teas and floribundas all 22 inches apart. And one of the things you discover when you're a recent rose planter is that when you buy a bare root rose, they're rather small, and that it'll look perfectly fine to plant them all that way, and that's how they were all planted. And within 8 months, I had Brer Rabbit's briar patch. I wanted to be an organic gardener. This may come as a surprise to many of you, but I was an organic gardener before you were. And I decided to buy ladybugs. So I went to the store and I bought a lot of ladybugs. And you see, the truth of the matter is I already knew what ladybugs do. I learned that in kindergarten. Ladybugs fly away home because their house is on fire and their children are burning. I wanted to control the aphids, so the ladybugs had all flown away. So I bought this brand new product called Safer Insecticidal Soap, and I used it on my aphids. And what did I get? I got clean aphids. I've noticed that they've changed the name of the soap. They now claim that it kills the aphids, and it's called insect killing soap. One day, I had read an article in the American Rose magazine, probably Howard Walter's column, because he periodically wrote about foliar feeding. And I confess to you that sometimes when I read articles, I don't read them too closely. And I remember things about them, but I don't remember enough things about them. And I recall reading several articles over time about the advantages of foliar feeding. And so one day I decided that my roses were looking a little peaked, probably because it was July. So I loaded up my sprayer with a liquid fertilizer in order to foliar feed them, having selected for the project Peters 20-20-20. So I loaded up my sprayer and I went out and I foliar fed my roses in July when the temperature was 96 degrees, Peters 20-20-20. And the next day, the roses began to turn yellow, all the leaves, and by the third day, every single leaf had fallen off of my roses. I learned from that to read a little better about what I'm reading and to pay a little more attention to what it is that I'm doing. After a few years there, 1985, I moved to our third rose garden. This is a fairly recent picture, and those are also roses that I planted at the third rose garden. This was a magnificent estate, a green and green architectural home in Pasadena. My wife was big into that. I was mostly enamored with the fact that I now had a space that I could plant as many roses as I had originally tried to plant, but I had a much larger space that I could plant these roses in. It also came with a state-of-the-art watering system. This wonderful watering system, you see, it had this dial, and you could put the time of day that the water would come on. It had this thing down here that you could put little pegs in that would tell you the day of the week. The pegs said T for Tuesday and TH for Thursday and so on. So you could put the pegs in, and you could set this all up for watering. And I went to a Rose Society meeting. This is when I first joined a Rose Society. I joined the Pasadena Rose Society. And the Pasadena Rose Society, we had a consulting rosarian, and it's when we were going through the first of our water restrictions. And he said, in order to conserve water, we should water in the middle of the night. So I set this to go off at 1 o'clock in the morning. I can tell you one of the disadvantages of watering in the middle of the night is you don't know whether your system is working or not, because you're usually in bed asleep when the water goes off. Drink of water there. Behind you is my water bottle in the little black thing. So it's all set off to go at 1 o'clock in the morning, and then we were having a district convention, and I had just begun to show roses. And I wanted to prepare for the district convention, which is to be held in May, and I attended another meeting of the Rose Society where we had a speaker on exhibiting who said that the most important thing in exhibiting is water, which, by the way, is true. And so I said, well, okay, I had cut back my watering because of the water crisis, and it had been winter time, so I decided to increase the watering by a day. And so I put in another peg for the day. And it began to get warmer, and so I decided to increase my watering, and I put in another peg for the day. And I'm coming home one day, and it just seemed to me that the roses were unusually dry. I figured, well, I'm not putting in enough water. So I went in and I put in another day. And I came home, I don't know, a week later, I'm looking at it, and the roses still seem pretty dry. And so I put in another peg, and this went on, and finally one day, I just put a peg in every single hole. So I'm gonna water these things every day. And I came home, and now it's really dry. And so it finally occurs to me that something is wrong. So I listened to it, and the mechanics were working, and I ran it through each one of the sections and went upstairs. And this thing is down in the basement, by the way. So you got to go down steps into the basement, off the steps out to see whether or not the water's on, back down. So this is a long process. And I checked every single station, and every single station was working on a manual basis. And the device was working. So, puzzled by the whole thing, I did something that I had never done before, which was to open the door there and to read the instructions. And this is from the instructions. This particular timer comes with a 14-day skipper. And if you can see that the 14-day skipper feature permits irrigation to be omitted on selected days. So when you put in a peg for that day, that means it's not going to water on that day. So if you put a peg into all 14 holes, you will get no water at all. Look, Bob, look. I could have learned that in kindergarten. Years later, I learned this. I love this. We teach in the Consulting Rosarian seminars. We always show the soil triangle. How many of you have sandy loam? 2. Yeah, that's about average. Sandy loam is about average. As I've mentioned, the soil in Pasadena is not a whole lot different than it is in Irvine. I decided to plant, and I decided that what I would put into my hole was vermiculite. So somebody told me at the local shop that that's a good thing to put into your planting medium, is to put in vermiculite. And I had, you know what vermiculite is, my friends? Vermiculite is a clay. It's closely related to bentonite, which is also known as kitty litter. And if you put clay in with clay, you create bricks. I learned this in that place. I learned the difference between vermiculite and perlite. Perlite, which is sometimes called sponge rock for reasons that I have no idea, because it is not a sponge, and it in fact increases your drainage, and is what I learned that you use with clay soils. That picture on the left, I was attracted to it because we have a young boy digging a hole to China. When I was in kindergarten, I decided to dig a hole to China. I don't know how many people do that. I've run into, anybody else dig a hole to China? Yeah, look at that, see? You get that ball in the class, you know, oh, China's on the other side of the earth, you can dig a hole to China. You know, I think I got about that deep, about as deep as the kid did. But anyway, this is pretty much what a hole looked like in several sections of my yard there in that big mansion that I showed you. And I put water in it and nothing happened. The water didn't drain. I was having a problem with roses I had planted there, and so I had to take them up and see what was going on, and this is what I was seeing. I put water in, a day later, this water would still be there. So I got out the drawings that I had from the original layout of the garden, and the house, which had been built, by the way, in 1906, originally had a circular driveway in front. And the circular driveway went right through 2 sections of my rose garden. And sure enough, if you dug down there, I found asphalt. I found sand about so thick that was the bed of the circular driveway, and that's what the problem was. I developed then a technique that I use to this day. That is a perfect opportunity to use your earth auger, the one that you use for planting bulbs. If you make a hole for your rose, and then take right at the bottom of the hole and drill a very long hole, I drilled it right through that entire substrate, whoop, and it drained, and it worked. It was in this garden that I learned about rabbit pellets. I read articles about rabbit pellets being good for roses. I speak here of that which goes into rabbits and not that which comes out of rabbit. The I got the rabbit pellets. I went to the store. I mean, I'd read about the benefits of alfalfa. And having read of the benefits of alfalfa, I went to the store. I found rabbit pellets. They had alfalfa in it. I went out and I spread these rabbit pellets around. And that evening, as I was resting from my labors in the hot tub, and I looked up on the wires behind us, and I saw the roof rats running back and forth on the wires, and I thought about the alfalfa pellets out there. I said, oh my God, I have created a feeding ground for rats. But the fact is by watering them in very carefully, I did not, and I found, and I use that to this day. That's where I learned about fertilizers. I know you're going to have your consulting rosarian advice and so on. I still think this is the best advice, that the best fertilizer is the one on sale. It is in this garden that I had my first case of downy mildew. Terrible, terrible disease. That's what downy mildew looks like for those of you who have not seen it. I went to a rose show. I had made an entry. Dr. Justin Ecuon saw several of my roses. He came up to me and said, Bob, he says, you have downy mildew in your roses. I said, oh my God. Because I had just finished reading this article in American Rose Annual written by Ray Riddell about his bout with downy mildew up at Garden Valley Ranch. And so I called up my good friend and neighbor, Tom Caruth, and I said, Tom, Justin says I've got downy mildew. And Tom says, well, that's not a surprise considering the way the weather's been. And I said, Tom, what do you do when you get downy mildew? And he said, I turn up the heat in the greenhouse. Thank you very much, Tom. That's very helpful. But what he was telling me, and that I later learned in my research, is that downy mildew doesn't like heat. This is from my consulting rosarian stuff. Basically, what this all adds up to is that downy mildew does not like heat. And it was at that time I was editing the Pasadena Rose newsletter, and I shared newsletters with people from around the country, and somebody somewhere, and I don't remember who, was experimenting with using hot water on their roses in order to combat downy mildew. And he had hooked up, if I recall the article right, the hot water hose from the washing machine and was out there putting it on his roses. And for some God knows what reason, that struck me as a good idea. We had a friend of ours staying with us who was from England, and when he left, he gave us a tea kettle. Actually gave it to my wife, but I hid it from her because I saw an electric tea kettle. This is a perfect opportunity, and when she was away one day, I went outside and I brewed up batch after batch of and I was concerned that if you put hot water on, it would turn cold right away. So if you started with really hot, struck me as the way to go about it. And so I had 13 miniature roses. I went out and I poured boiling water on 13 miniature roses. And I can tell you, for those of you interested in the scientific aspect of it, that 11 of them were absolutely cured of downy mildew. Because 11 of them were dead. The other 2 survived and didn't show a lot of downy mildew thereafter. In 1996, I moved to my 4th rose garden. This is also in Pasadena, California. This is a house that looked like a church. It was done by a noted architect, Gerrit Van Pelt, and so I filled out the front of the house with roses. I used a lot of pots. I found containers. This is where I did a lot of container gardening and found how useful they can be. I found the miniatures in containers is where I started using 7-gallon squat pots for miniatures, which I use to this day as being the best type of a container for a miniature rose. I learned the use of a skeleton hand bamboo back scratcher. The problem you see with a miniature container like that is when you're doing your cleanup at pruning time and you want to rake. How do you rake? You get a skeleton hand bamboo back scratcher and you rake around your little miniature rose. It was here I started using Felco number 8 pruners, which is what I use for those of you who ask what I use in the garden. I also learned the use of this device by losing it. You know what this device is, don't you, you who use Felco? This is how you take apart your Felcos so that you can clean them and fix them, and you should be able to do this with it. And I learned that also by getting another pair of Felcos, and this time keeping the little key. I use the value of a knife. For those of you who carry around pruning shears, I always carry around a pruning knife as well. And this is the number of uses for it I continue to come up with, not the least of which is opening bags of material, cutting things. It's just useful, and it was here that I started using this tool, a combination tool holder that you could put the knife in and the pruning shears. I started roses in containers. It was here that I started that practice, which I continue to this day. I start large roses in 5-gallon containers. I start miniatures in 1-gallon containers, often graduate them to 5 gallons or then into the 7-gallon squat pots. And so I had my pot Ghetto there. This does not begin to match Greg's pot Ghetto. Nothing ever will match that, I understand. But I had my own, and I had that little device, that little table I built, which was my propagating table outdoors. As you can see, it just had 1-gallon containers on it. Baldo will recognize this. He would stop by the pet rose nursery, and I would shove plants into his hand as he left. It was here that I undertook my breeding program for the first time, and I show that. That's my breeding space. And that's what I produced out of it. Margie, named after my mother, Pasadena Star, bred in Pasadena. Buttercream, Peter Cottontail, sister seedlings, both crosses of Admiral Lindbergh by Farrow. Bolivar, Peachy Cheeks. How did I get started in this breeding program? I bought the little $5 book from the Rose Hybridizers Association. You want to get into this? I put this up here to show you can do this. In fact, one of the most fun things about roses I have found is breeding roses. It's like having children. You go down every day and something's in bloom, and oh wow, you know, and they're all wonderful. And then suddenly you got thousands of them, you've got to start throwing them away. I had a miniature rose garden. This was my first miniature rose garden. This was on a patio in the back, and these were all miniature roses. I had my good friend George Mander sent me the very first plants of glowing amber and amber star that were available in this country. He sent me 8 of them. And one day I was walking by the glowing amber, and I had a big, long cane coming off of it. I said, wow, I wonder if I have a climbing spore of glowing amber. So I staked it up, marked it with the orange tag, and decided that I would observe it. And it hadn't bloomed. In fact, it wasn't a bud in the end. It's just a big, long thing that had gone up like that. And so I used to talk at that point in time just about every other week with George, and George called up one day, and we were chatting, and I said, by the way, you know, I think I might have a climbing spore of glowing amber. He said, really? He says, I'd love to have that. Would you give that to me? I said, well, sure, George, but you know, it hasn't even bloomed yet, so I'm not sure what I've got, if anything. He said, oh, no, you got to send it to me. And so he made arrangements. George is in Canada. So he drove down to Washington State in order to receive a package that I had carefully sent to him of the climbing sport of glowing amber. Some time went by, and I was out looking at my climbing sport, which still had not bloomed, and I was kind of cleaning up around it with my bamboo rake, and I said to myself, is that a bud union? Oh my. So I went inside, and I looked at the shipping invoice that he had sent me, and he realized that, oh my gosh, he had sent me a couple of budded plants. And in fact, the phone rang right at that very moment. And it was George. George, you know that climbing sport of glowing amber? I said, yeah. He said, did that by chance come off of the one that I had budded for you on Rosa canina? I said, yes. He says, you sent me cuttings of Rosa canina. Yes, I did. My climbing sport of glowing amber. It was in this garden that I learned the benefit of fish. I love fish as a fertilizer. People ask what I use today. I use this stuff, organic gem, which we get in Arizona when we're visiting in Arizona. I don't know if there's a place around here you can get it. It's a hydrolyzed fish process that is cold pressed rather than cooked. And the way I apply fish to the garden is I use 32-gallon trash cans, which I then fill up and put the fish in. And I take 1-gallon Rubbermaid pitchers and I apply them 1 per plant. I do this to this day. I was out in the garden. In fact, I was in that lower section where the pot ghetto was, and I'm putting one after another, and I hear this clunk. You don't look around, I can't see where the clunk has come from, and then I get down to the bottom of it, and I pour it out, and I pour out my cell phone. So it was there that I learned to leave the cell phone in the house. For those of you, again, who are mechanically minded and interested in how electronics react to fish emulsion, my cell phone smelled like a fish, and it never worked again. In 2002, I moved to Arizona. I moved to Arizona to chase down my beautiful wife, and I learned to garden in Arizona. And that gardening in Arizona can be a challenge. The first summer I was there, we had 125 consecutive days of over 100 degrees. Now let me tell you about that. You can say, and I told Donna, 100 degrees, we get 100 degrees in Pasadena 2 or 3 times a year. You know, I'd go out and garden 100 degrees. Well, you can go out and garden 100 degrees in Pasadena, but you try to do this in Arizona. I went out one day in 100 degrees, and about 4 hours later, I was, you know, I nearly had heat stroke. I mean, it was just like somebody hitting you with a hammer. And it's like that every single day. But still, in the springtime, in April, when the roses are in bloom, or in November, you can have extraordinarily beautiful roses in Arizona. Arizona, as I have mentioned, is hot. There is the average temperature. That yellow line at the top is 100 degrees. You see this? That is a summer in Arizona. And that's where I learned, again, that the most important thing in growing roses is water. And I thought that it would be a great idea to water, and water. And I explained to Donna how to grow roses in Arizona. But do I listen to her? What I went to do is I overhead watered, thought that would keep them cool. Water in Arizona is about 8.2 in its hardness, and what it does is puts this wonderful crust over the top of your roses and of your blooms. I watered heavily in the ground. I had believed at this point that you cannot overwater a rose. This is my brother and I in our rain gear. This is what we wore in Ohio when it rained. And I thought you can't overwater a rose. One day I walked by a specimen of, what I did is in that hard soil, I had these holes dug, and I filled them all full of organic matter, and then I watered them like crazy. It's like creating a bathtub of organic material. And what you get when you do that is I walked by and I had a dead Playboy, and I picked it up like that, and I went, and it just, the smell of methane came out of the ground. And I learned that you can in fact overwater a rose, and you can create what is called anaerobic digestion, and you can create methane, and if you're a smoker, you can just blow the roses out of the ground. So we learned about the right drip irrigation, courtesy of my beautiful wife. This is Netafim, which is what we use in Arizona, and we use today in Escondido. I learned about Fortuniana rootstock. If you read my book, I say, I'm not a believer in Fortuniana rootstock. We grow big roses in California. I don't need to know anything about this. I was wrong. There I am standing among Fortuniana-grown hybrid teas, wearing my traditional gardening hat, which is a Cleveland Indians baseball hat. Shortly after this picture came out in the American Rose magazine, when I received the Hedrick Award, I received a letter from the president of the Cleveland Indians, who were moving their training grounds to Arizona, and he was thrilled to find that there was some idiot in Arizona who grew roses who wore Cleveland Indian baseball hats, and the letter ended with, "Go Tribe." For those of you from the East Coast, you'll have learned years ago about avoiding the third rail, which is the electrified rail in Arizona. I learned the truth of this proposition. I learned from Baxter Williams, which is to avoid the third row. If you are planting your rose garden, do not put in a third row. You can't get to the roses in the center. That's what you wind up getting, and particularly if they're on Fortuniana rootstock. I learned that it's easy to kill thrips. You can't quite tell from this picture, but there are a bazillion of these little blue sticky traps. This is prior to a district show. I bought 50 blue sticky traps to monitor the appearance of thrips in our garden in Arizona. They are about the size of bats, or so it would seem. It's very easy to kill them, but the problem is that all their uncles, their nephews and nieces and cousins come to the funeral the next day. If you have a solution to thrips, I'm still looking for that one. I was out trying to handle the thrips by spraying insecticides like crazy, and I managed to kill the thrips, and we went off to California for a weekend and came back and found this on our lavaglut. Donna thought we had found a new generation of new type of spider mites, but spider mites love insecticides because it kills the insects and leaves room for the spider mites to go crazy. And you wind up with something that looks like it's from a haunted house. All right, we'll fast forward. We get to my 6th rose garden. 2008, we have moved to Escondido. I've taken a job with a law firm in San Diego. We rented this house. This house had hillsides. This house, since I already had grown in Pasadena and I had already grown in Arizona, and that covered the entire known universe as I knew it, I knew what the soil would be like, and so I prepared and amended the soil in Escondido just exactly as if it were the soil in Pasadena and or Arizona. It is neither. This stuff is decomposed granite. Decomposed granite drains like a sieve. So if you go and try to, I'm putting in perlite and other stuff in order to increase the drainage. I went out into the garden one day after it rained like 3 inches of rain, and there wasn't a puddle in the garden. The lesson there is find out what your soil is. Don't just believe that you know what it is because it's something like what you had before. I made ring, well, here's back ring around the roses. See these rings? For hillside. This is what I developed for hillside. I produce rings. And what are the rings made from? Vigoro Eco edging and a stapler right from my office, one of the power staplers. Cut it, make a ring, staple it, and you can make rings to put around your roses, fill them up, and so that the water doesn't all either run down the hill or disappear. And Greg will appreciate this. Escondido is the gopher capital of the world. Particularly where we moved, I decided, first of all, For inspiration, I would watch the movie, which I did, and I made a treaty. I was telling people about the treaty. We have a down area in the house that we're at right now, and I said, okay, I talked to the Gopher King, if you'll keep your troops down there, I won't kill you. And so that was the deal I made, which he has violated continuously. My first line of defense are cages. I have 320 roses now in the ground in our new place in Escondido. I developed this at the old place. I just used 20-weight chicken wire, and I fashioned cages around a 5-gallon container. I have 320 roses in cages. I have one rose, well, I'll come to that in a moment. It's at our 7th rose garden. This is where we live now. For those of you who were there on the convention tour at the National Convention in May will recognize this garden. And I've learned all these things about growing roses, and I've now put them to work at this new garden. Here you see hybrid teas in rows of 2. Here you will see floribundas. And yes, they do get that big. Here you will see many floras all down the side of the driveway. I saved the story of the gopher because this is right between my driveway and the neighbor's driveway, and she's got roses and a very good rose grower, and I got the roses along here, and I'd never seen a gopher there, any gopher activity. And I had a space right down to the end, and I had a cinnamon girl in a 7-gallon container. I don't like the rose cinnamon girl. And nevertheless, you know, it shows from time to time, so I decided I would put this rose into the ground. But it's a 7-gallon container. It's a lot tougher to create one of these round things. So I haven't seen a gopher here. I will put it in the ground, and it was the only rose in the ground that was not in a gopher cage. Maybe 2 weeks later, I pull into the driveway and I look over, and Cinnamon Girl is lying on its side. And I went over and I picked it up, and the gopher had eaten off every single root, and you could see his little teeth marks right at the top, finishing off that rose. The only one in the garden. There are now 320 roses in the ground in this garden, every one in a gopher basket. They include miniature roses, shrubs. This is that wonderful rose, Graham Thomas, that David Austin described in the first book I bought from him as a 4x4 shrub. I learned that one too. Old garden roses. We filled in these areas. Those walls were there so I could put in them. In order to get to them, in case you wonder, I love this. You know, I have these all over the place, the little molded plastic step stools, so I can get up into that garden. We have climbers on vinyl climbing fences. I have polyanthas in the front. I owe my polyantha love to Greg Lowry, who I ordered a half a dozen from years ago, and I wrote an article about gourmet popcorn and whether or not it was a polyantha. I have 35 different varieties of polyanthas, half of which I think, well, probably 2/3 of which trace from vintage gardens. All right, we have here Snow White and the 7 dwarfs are in this particular garden, the 7 polyantha dwarfs. I bought these for Donna for her birthday. For those of you who like garden gnomes, these are combat garden gnomes. Some guy up here makes these. It has my own pot ghetto. It has the potting soil. This is what I use for potting. There'll be an article about this in ARS&U. I love this 85-ounce cast aluminum scoop. You know, when you're trying to dig out potting soil, you know, use a trowel, doesn't work. 85 ounces, consider how big that is. That's what I use for potting. I love this little shovel. This thing is a little shovel. It's about this big, and it is a very handy little shovel that I learned to use there. I grow this wonderful climber night owl that I like a lot, and I had it in a container because originally I had a specimen. We had taken it to the San Diego Fair for a demonstration garden, and I'm walking by it one day, and I saw a bright red version of night owl. And I said, wow, I have a sport of night owl, a red sport of night owl. And it bloomed, and it was a brilliant red, and it looked just like night owl, except that it was red. And so I marked it with an orange tape, and I'd walk by, and I was very careful about it, and I'm going to propagate it because I have a bright red sport of night owl. And then one day I'm walking by it, and I said, I have a bright red. Doesn't the story sound familiar? What in the world is a bright red sport of night owl? For God's sake, it looks just like this, which is, of course, Dr. Huey. So if you ever get a bright red sport of night owl or something else, I had Dr. Huey. Yep, I did it again. I introduced this wonderful sport of Randy Scott that I named after Donna Martin, and I put it under drainage redo because I had three of these that I had propagated in a 5-gallon containers, and I decided to put into the ground in a spot, dug a hole, put the basket in, put the thing in, walked by, the leaves are turning yellow, looking better, looking worse. So I removed them, poured water into the hole, and the hole did not drain because I hadn't checked it first. You would think I'd learn. One of them didn't make it. One of my favorite sayings about roses, this famous saying from Dean Hole in his book about roses. This is from the 1869 version. He who would have beautiful roses in his garden must have beautiful roses in his heart. A wonderful, wonderful sentiment. And it is, in fact, exactly how he starts off his book, because it says, he who would have beautiful roses in his garden must have beautiful roses in his heart. He must love them well and always. And it goes on like that. And it's a wonderful read. And if you haven't read this, this is worthwhile. You will fall in love with roses again if you read this book. But one of the interesting things about it is people recognize that saying so much. You know what they don't really pay attention to is the title of the chapter. Can you imagine writing a rose book today and you started off with Chapter 1, Causes of Failure? Well, yeah, there are a lot of causes of failure, but I hope that I've given you some idea that even though we fail, we learn from our failure. Here is a picture of me. I'm the one right here. This will demonstrate that it is true that I was born in a suit. This is my brother Jack, my mother and my father. And I recall, before going to kindergarten, my brother, of course, was then in first grade. He's 2 years older. And we had chores right from day one. I mean, you know, when you turn 5, you got your first assignment as a chore person. And my assignment, I dried the dishes and he washed them. And one day I was drying, he was washing, and he was telling me what it was like and what I could look forward to in kindergarten. And he told me that one thing that I would have to do in kindergarten is to write a master's thesis. I had no idea what a thesis was. I had no idea what I would write about. I was very concerned about this, that I would be required to go to kindergarten and do something that I had no idea what it was. I can tell you that in roses, you do not need to write a master's thesis. You just need to dress the part. And then you wind up with a rose garden. And you do this through trial and error, through making mistakes, through enjoying all the mistakes as you make them. And if you do that for 43 years, which is how long I've been doing it, you may wind up with a garden that looks like that. Donna's favorite picture of the garden. And I continue the breeding program. This one will come out soon, a nice mini flora single, bronze medal, Angel Grace, named after my granddaughter. Coconut shrimp. How about a mini flora, David Austin type of rose? This one I simply named, it's a Whit Wells rose. My daughter, Elisha, was visiting. I've always wanted to name a rose after her. Elisha is like the Elysian fields, so I figured it had to be a beautiful white rose, but she loves tattoos. This is my granddaughter, Angel Grace, Evangeline Grace. This is my daughter's arm with her tattoo. And I was testing this rose, and I showed it to her, and I said, boy, that reminds me of your tattoo. Maybe I could get it named after you. She said, gee, could you do that, Dad? So I called up Richard Anthony, my friend, and I said, can I name that rose? And he said, sure. What do you want to call it? I said, well, let me check it out. And so I was originally going to call it Tattooed Lady, but Sean McCann registered a Tattooed Lady several years ago. And so I came down to either calling it Tattooed Mom or Tattooed Daughter. And I reasoned that there, from a marketing standpoint, the more people would buy a rose for their tattooed daughter than would for their tattooed mom. Donna will have passed these out. I am running for vice president. I have a brochure. I have a magnet, which we will be delighted to give you unless she's put them out there.
Yeah, there's a little tray in the back that has the magnets.
And there are
A brochure, and there's also
buttons that say Bob. So feel free to pick one up or several up, take them back to your society. Check out my website at www.bobmartinarsvp.com. And that is the exit door of Robinson School and the end.